Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Brian Taylor. I'm an engineer, researcher, trumpet player, composer, and arranger, and I wanted to make this video to talk about the commonalities between music and engineering. So the Velvet Note in Atlanta asked me if there are similarities between music and engineering, and that's a really good question. I mean, so often you hear people say maybe things like, oh, I'm not that creative, I couldn't do this music thing, or I couldn't do anything with art, or you might hear someone say, oh, I don't have the logical mind or the analytical mind to do something like engineering or science. So, if you were to ask me, are there commonalities between music and engineering, my answer is a wholehearted, unequivocal yes. There are absolutely similarities between music and engineering. And while I could go on about this for days, I'm just going to talk about five that I have seen and experienced in my life. And those are creativity, innovation, discipline, communication, and perseverance and determination. So let's start with creativity. So, creativity. So, there's a quote from famed aerodynamicist and engineer Theodore von Karman, and he said that scientists discover the world that exists, engineers create the world that never was. And I think the latter part of that quote really encapsulates what music and engineering are all about. At their cores, both music and engineering are about creating something that never existed. Both of them start with an idea that only exists, in your mind, and you've got to turn that idea into something that can exist within the boundaries of the real world. So engineers are tasked with solving problems and building machines and devices. Well, if you're going to build or solve anything, you have to first have the seeds of that solution come to being within your imagination and your mind. And then that solution has to be informed by your knowledge of physics and how the world actually works so you can take it from your mind to something you can see and touch. And it's the same thing with music, whether you're playing a known piece or scoring a brand new composition for a big band or an orchestra or improvising a solo, you have to conceive of the sound that you want to hear in your head first. And then you've got to figure out how to bring that sound to fruition in a convincing manner based on what you know about melody and harmony and rhythm and orchestration. And so this leads me to my next point, which is innovation. So engineering and music are all about innovation. And in my mind, innovation is really about tackling a problem in a way that no one else ever really thought of. So in engineering, this is how you come up with new solutions for new problems or new solutions for old problems, or even figure out a way to apply an old solution to a new problem. So as you can imagine, innovation, I think, is very, very closely linked to creativity. This is how we went from cameras that took really crude still images to Polaroids to camera phones. It's how we went from the Wright Flyer to transatlantic flight to putting people into space to missions like Juno. In music, when you think of well-known names like Bach or Debussy or Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, Maria Schneider, Michael Jackson, James Brown, Lady Gaga, Adele, these are all people who pushed their art form in some way, and they employed a fresh approach, or they did something different that made people go, "Hey, wait a minute, that's really interesting." So they really, they kind of pushed the boundaries and tried to expand the frontier. Now, innovation and creativity are very good and they're very important, but they don't really mean a whole lot without discipline. Creativity and innovation really don't mean a whole lot without hard work and discipline. I'm sorry, there's really no way around it. Both music and engineering take immense amounts of training and practice to gain fluency and proficiency. You always hear about engineering students working on problem sets upon problem sets upon problem sets, or music students practicing scales and intervals and technique studies. And what you have to realize is that these things are no different than an athlete that's working out or doing different types of drills. Whether it's an athlete doing drills or a musician practicing or an engineer solving different types of problems in repetition, it's how you gain the facility and the fluency in your field to be able to tackle anything that comes your way. So in music, all the practice you do is how you gain the facility to play a difficult or unknown musical passage. In engineering, it's how you gain the ability to solve and deal with problems that you've never ever seen. When you think of two people like the Wright brothers, who helped invent flight, they didn't just build a plane out of thin air. They built their own wind tunnel, and they did a lot of experiments with it to design and build their airplane. So they did a lot of work and put a lot of effort into really understanding the underlying mechanics of how their airplane was going to work, so that when they built it, it actually did what they wanted it to do. When you think of people like Michael Brecker and Dizzy Gillespie, these are pioneers in music and very big names in jazz, and they worked tirelessly to understand and incorporate different types of harmonic concepts and approaches. And they worked very hard and practiced a lot of these things so that when they went to play, they were not only able to employ these things, but they were able to employ it in a way that sounded very natural and effortless. So ultimately, you may have a very good imagination, you might have a lot of really good ideas, but it takes work to bring those ideas to life, and there's really no royal road to doing that. So let's talk a little bit about communication. So in both music and engineering, you have to communicate with people who do and do not have your level of training or understanding about a subject, and you may or may not get to do that communicating verbally. Yet, when you go to communicate, everyone has to understand what it is you're trying to get across. So if you think about soloing in jazz, when you're playing a solo, the other musicians on the stage have the same training as you, but the audience may or may not. So you have to play something that makes enough musical sense such that the musicians on stage can help you tell the story that you're trying to tell, but at the same time, that story has to make enough sense such that the audience can understand it and go with you. And all of that is done without words. As an engineer, you very well may spend part of your day talking to a peer who's got the same kind of technical training as you. So you can go into a lot of details, and you maybe can use a lot of jargon or go into a lot of the weeds, as it were, about a particular subject. In that same day, you might then have to go talk to someone who's trained in a completely different area and doesn't have your basic level of understanding of something, or baseline level of understanding, but they still have to be able to understand your work well enough to do their part. So think about talking to a lawyer who's going to help you work on patenting an idea, or maybe talking to someone who's going to help market your idea, or maybe you're going to go talk to another scientist or engineer that is in a completely different discipline. So I'm a mechanical engineer by training, but I do bio-inspired engineering work, and so I also talk to biologists. And when I go to talk to a mechanical engineer, it's a very different experience than talking to a biologist, but both groups have to understand me. So the last big quality that I think is similar between engineering and music, or it's really a trait that you need to really thrive and succeed in both, is determination, or really determination and perseverance. And these relate very closely to discipline. So, some people might have a natural talent for aspects of music or engineering, but no one becomes an expert or a virtuoso after one try. You're going to have periods where you fall down. You're going to have periods where you can't do something. You're going to have periods where something doesn't work. And you have to be prepared to work through the periods where you can't do something well or get it to work in order to get to the point where something works or is second nature to you. So if you think of learning to walk and talk, you couldn't do either of those things when you were born. And when you finally started trying to take your very first steps, they were really wobbly, and you probably fell down a whole lot, but it didn't bother you, you didn't let that bother you, you just kind of kept getting back up and trying to walk, and eventually you could walk with a little bit of help, and then you could walk, and then you could run, and then your parents probably were thinking, well, it was great when I could put them down and I didn't have to worry about them going anywhere, but no, they were probably very happy to see you learn to walk. It's the same kind of thing with music and engineering. So the first lesson I ever took on the trumpet back in elementary school, it took all of us an hour just to get a sound out of the instrument. And it was the same thing when I took a saxophone lesson in 7th grade. The very first lesson, it took me an hour to get a sound out of the instrument. And the teacher told me that the only thing she wanted me to think about initially was just loud and nasty. Because her thing was, once you can do loud and nasty and just make a honk on the instrument, then we can start trying to put notes to that honk. And then if we can do that, then we can start trying to shape it into something musical. So it was hard at first, but it just took time. But when I started taking thermodynamics in college, it was interesting. It was really cool stuff. But I'm not going to lie, it was really hard, and it kind of hurt. It was very daunting. It was a lot of information. And it started to make a little bit more sense in the next fluids course that I took. And then I took aerodynamics after that, and then it really started to make sense. And then I took propulsion after that. And that's where it really started to make sense, where I really started to say, okay, now I think I'm starting to understand this. So that's 4 classes over 3 years that is what it took me to really start to feel like I was getting a handle on fluid mechanics and thermodynamics and heat transfer. So these things that you try and do in music and engineering, they might not all happen right away, and you might have periods where you stumble, and you might have periods where you're not getting it. I mean, I still have things that I'm working on understanding and getting better with in both music and engineering. And at the end of the day, it's just about putting one foot in front of the other and knowing that if you continue to do that, no matter how hard it gets, if you keep the determination and you just say, I'm just going to keep going towards the goal, eventually you'll be able to look back and say, wow, I had a really interesting journey and I covered a lot of ground. And it's not really about the goal, it's about the journey. All right, so let's wrap up. Creativity, innovation, discipline, communication, and determination. These are just some of the ways that I would say that music and engineering are the same. And when you think about things from those perspectives, a lot of things in life aren't actually all that different from one another. And at least I know for me, when I think about things from those perspectives, what I know in one field or one area is actually able to help me in another area. So several years ago, just as a for instance, I started trying to eat a little bit healthier. And eating healthy was never something I was very good at. And I remember it just dawned on me one day, Brian, you're so disciplined with practicing your instrument or working on your PhD work. This isn't any different. And literally the week that I thought like that, like the moment I thought like that, vegetables started happening every single day. I mean, because I realized, I already knew what I needed to know. I had the tools that I needed to have. Music and engineering both taught me the discipline and the determination that I needed to actually go out and just, buy the right kinds of foods and try and eat a little bit better. And so when I applied that from one aspect of my life to another aspect of my life, it didn't really seem as hard to do. Whereas before, if you think about it as this brand new thing, it's almost like impossible for you to do it. So I think if we focus on the similarities between music and engineering, I think they can both help each other grow to new heights. So maybe if you're, for instance, a more engineering-minded person or a more analytical and technically minded person, don't think about that as being, oh, well, I'm a very analytical, technically minded person. I'm not creative at all. Well, think of all the ways that you have to be creative to be an analytically, technically minded person. The same ways if you're a music or arts person, don't think about, oh, well, this is very emotive. This is very creative. This is not like engineering, well, or the sciences. Well, think of all the ways that this is like the sciences. I mean, yes, it's very emotive, it's very, very creative, but there's also a lot of fundamental things that you have to really know and understand in order to do what you're trying to do. And it's the same thing in engineering and the sciences. So, like I said, I think if we focus on the similarities between music and engineering, they can actually both help each other to grow, and they can help make us all maybe a little bit more well-rounded. At least that's all my opinion. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and maybe it gave you something to think about. Hopefully it helped you learn a little bit. Anyway, take care.